Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and on behalf of the Africa-led Partnership Secretariat, my name is Joshua Gad, and I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you all to this third in a series of webinars that we've held. The title of today's webinar is Assessing Opportunities for Agricultural Productive Uses of Energy in Sub-Saharan Africa, focusing on the development of a new geospatial mapping tool. For those of you who have been with us along this series, you will know that this is the third in the series of webinars. We have partnered with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, who are implementing the Clean and Advanced Technologies for Sustainable Landscapes, or CTSL program, in Africa and in Southeast Asia. So far, the program within the African context works in 3 countries, being Zambia, Kenya, and Mozambique. And each of the preceding webinars have covered a different area, focusing on the productive uses of energy, whether it's in agriculture and the rest. So we are very pleased to have our panel from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, who partner with us as the Africa-led Partnership. And I'm going to hand over to Tim Reba to set us going. Of course, just one small note is that in case you're joining this as the first of the series that you're attending, the prior 2 webinars, we have recordings and all of the proceedings on the Africa-led Partnership website, which we shall share at the end of the day. But as always, this session, as well as the others, this session is going to be recorded, and we will have the proceedings as well as the video up on our website in the next few days. But welcome to all of you who've joined. I know a few more people might be joining, but for those of you who've joined, I think in the interests of time, we're going to begin, and I'm going to hand over to you, Tim. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Josh. Amanda, if you have a moment, please go ahead and share the slides. That'd be super. Yeah, so great to see so many attendees here. See some friendly faces and also some new faces. I think we also have a couple of colleagues from the U.S. Department of Agriculture as well on the line. So good morning, good afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining. So just a little bit of background in terms of today's session. Oh, sorry, Josh or Roy, are you able to give Amanda screen sharing permission?
Yes, let's just make sure we have that.
Super, thanks. Well, while we get that sorted out. So in terms of a little bit of background for the project, I think many of you are already quite familiar with the Clean Technologies for Sustainable Landscapes project, or CTSL as we call it for short. This is a project that was funded by the U.S. Department of State and intends to support countries in scaling up productive use of energy, specifically for agricultural applications. So when we talk about agricultural applications of productive use, or PUE, we're talking about things like irrigation pumping, grain milling, grain processing, various value addition processes along the agricultural value chain, as well as things like refrigeration for dairy, poultry, livestock, and so forth. Great, there are the slides. Amanda, if you go to the next slide, please. Great. So in terms of today, so we'll do a little bit of providing a little bit of background here. We're going to hand it over to my colleague Amanda, who's going to talk through what are the methodologies that we have used under this project to evaluate productive uses of energy. And then we'll be handing it to our colleague Evan Rosenlieb, who's on the line here, and he's our geospatial data sciences expert, who's been working particularly with the teams in both Zambia and Kenya to develop out maps of where and what are the productive use opportunities for energy to help enhance crop production and other agricultural activities. We've taken the methodology that we've developed with our Zambia and Kenya colleagues, and we've expanded that now into what we're calling a Pan-African tool. So a map of the entire Sub-Saharan region, looking at various crops, looking at different productive uses, and trying to estimate what is the total aggregate productive use of energy demand for those areas. So Evan will take us through that tool a little bit, and then we'll have a little bit of Q&A. So Amanda, please, on to the next slide. Great. So as I was mentioning, so the CTSL project here is funded by the U.S. State Department through the end of this year. We've been working with Kenya and Zambia as well as Mozambique, and there's also an effort focused primarily on finance going on in Vietnam. And what this project is doing is working with these initial countries to provide tools, technical assistance, training to support planning and scale up of agricultural productive uses, particularly to make energy access more viable. Building on the lessons of the work we're doing with those individual countries, we'll be looking to provide peer exchange. And as Josh mentioned, this is exactly what today's webinar is the third in a regional peer learning series. So many of you hopefully joined the first two we had in December and then in February. So here we are for part 3. And then we'll also be providing some advisory support, hopefully to scale up these pilot projects once we've identified them. Please on to the next slide. So what this looks like is we're really taking sort of a 2-part analytical approach. So the first is this effort to map out specifically the where and what of where and what are these productive use opportunities. How can we help visualize them? How can we help determine within a country or within a region kind of where the highest priority places should be to look based on crop production, based on rainfall patterns, based on weather, based on livestock density, and so forth. We've been doing this using GIS tools, and Evan will get into that in a little bit more detail, and are now looking to bring this into NREL's Renewable Energy Data Explorer, or READY tool, to make these map layers a little bit more easily accessible. Part 2, once we understand kind of where are these productive use opportunities, we'll be trying to understand the local and broader economic impacts of scaling those up. So how does tapping into those agricultural productive uses help make energy access, particularly renewable energy powered mini grids, more viable from a business case perspective, and how can it help improve livelihoods and socioeconomic standing in the communities in which these mini grids are built? For that, we've been using the NREL's REOPT, or Renewable Energy Optimization tool, to do some techno-economic analysis of example mini grids in some of the areas we've identified that look quite promising. And those of you who joined last February session, we did a whole component on the REOPT tool and how we went about this. So we did it in a little bit of the opposite order, but for those interested in kind of part 2 of this analytical approach, please go back and review the February regional peer learning, which is available on the Africa LEDS Partnership website and also on YouTube. So today we'll really be focusing on this component 1 here. So I think with that, without any further ado, I will go ahead and hand it over to my colleague Amanda, who's going to take us through a little bit of background on how we developed estimates of productive use demand. And then she'll go ahead and hand it over to Evan for the bulk of today's session to walk us through the regional mapping tool. So Amanda, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tim. Okay, so I'm going to kind of just walk through in a bit more detail the process that Tim just described. So this is basically just a visual of that process. This entire analysis is conducted at a high geographic resolution. So our unit of analysis for everything that we're going to talk about today is a 10 square kilometer grid cell or 10 square kilometer area. And the analysis is performed across all of Sub-Saharan Africa. So for each 10 square kilometer area, we estimate hourly productive use electricity demand for a select set of productive uses, as well as we estimate hourly electricity demand for a community consisting of households and businesses, but excluding the productive uses, which we estimate separately. At this 10 square kilometer resolution, we also have hourly solar PV production factors. So then we take this data, and this is kind of what we're going to focus on mostly today, but I'll just complete the rest of the steps here. So we take this data, we also estimate the cost of mini-grid components and other financial and technical parameters for hybrid renewable mini-grids. And we feed all of that information into REOPT, this optimization tool that is free and open source and developed at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So we feed in the load and PV data, the financial and technical parameters, and we determine the least cost mini-grid configuration that could serve the estimated loads. So for each of these, for each grid cell that's analyzed with this entire workflow, we will then have the cost optimal mini-grid technologies and sizes, the levelized cost of energy for that system, and we can make this calculation for just the communities or the communities in addition to the productive uses of energy to compare system sizing and cost of electricity between those two scenarios. So we're just gonna dive a bit deeper into how we go about making these load estimates. Again, kind of the ultimate goal here is to showcase the final product, but we want to provide a bit of context on where these load estimates are coming from. So we're going to walk through load estimates for the community load profile as well as each of the productive uses. So firstly, to estimate community loads, we use geospatial data to estimate the population, the number of people in a given 10 square kilometer area. And then from the estimate of the population, we then make an assumption about how many different facilities that might use electricity are in that area. And then we use NREL's microgrid load profile explorer tool to obtain hourly load profiles for each of the facilities listed on the left. So when we add up the household and all of the different facility loads, then we arrive at our the community load profile. And if you're interested, there are a lot of assumptions built into this microgrid load profile explorer tool that we use to estimate this community load. And that is also an open source tool that you could find just by Googling this name. So then moving on to the productive use demand estimates. So we make these estimates for irrigation, refrigeration, egg incubation, hammer milling, shelling, hulling, and oil pressing. So we'll briefly walk through each of those, and I'll hand it over to Evan to describe irrigation.
All right, thanks, Amanda. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Apologies, I will remain off camera. I'm in the office today and it's extremely dark in here, so won't do anybody much good. So just going to briefly go over sort of the methodology that we use to estimate irrigation totals. We've gone over this a bit in previous sessions, although we've made some advancements into the methodology since then, and ultimately, a more complete documentation will be available and linked on the tool that we're going over that will allow people to download it and get all the nitty-gritty details if they are looking to understand it better. But just for a quick understanding of what we're doing here, we are using a methodology developed by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, which tries to estimate crop irrigation requirements, and it was based actually primarily on studies of crops in Africa. So it is a good sample and study for us to use. And there's I know this looks pretty mathematical, but it's a pretty simple concept. It really just uses 3 bits of information to calculate the water required at any given time for a crop, or the average daily water required for a crop. So so one is the reference evapotranspiration, and so that's sort of the most complicated metric that's involved in this, but all that is a measurement of how much water an average crop will lose due to things like winds and how hot it is and how intense the sun is. So obviously crops will lose more water and dry out quicker if they are under heavy sunlight on very hot days, and less so if it's cloudy and less hot. And so we use a global data set on calculated estimated evapotranspiration using climate data to give us that value that that's used for this equation. And then we adjust that value, which is sort of just the general evapotranspiration for any given month, for an average crop. We adjust that for each crop and its development growing stage based off of data that was made available through this FAO study. So obviously some crops need water more than others, and also different crops have different water requirements throughout the season. Usually they need the most in the middle of the season when they're growing the most, but that varies a bit from crop to crop. And so basically to understand the total crop water requirement, we simply apply these sort of crop coefficient adjustment values to the data in each location on the reference of evapotranspiration, which is derived from climate variables. Next slide. Okay, and then there's really only one more step after that. Once we understand the total water requirements for a crop in a month, then we just need to subtract out the amount of precipitation that crop gets during that month to understand that the added irrigation that's required. So it's possible, particularly in hot and rainier areas, that the crops need quite a bit of water, but also the environment is providing a lot of water in the form of rainfall. In fact, that is very common, and across the continent, most needed water needs for crops does come from rainfall, but we're just trying to figure out the gap between what the rainfall gives and how much water is required. And we are able to get long-term monthly precipitation values from WorldClim, which is a global climate data set. So this could be one thing to put a little bit of a finer point on. We're not currently considering groundwater. The FAO paper that we're following here does point out that in most of the places that are dry enough that they require supplemental irrigation, then the amount of water that crops get from groundwater is fairly minimal. May not hold in every location that we look at, but that is sort of the assumption made in the study that we're following. Okay, next slide. All right, and this is a pretty grainy picture here. I think it was a small photo in the paper, but this just gives you a little bit idea of what these crop coefficients look like for a potential crop over the season. So I'm not sure what crop this is, or even if it's any specific crop, or just sort of an example of these values, but it shows how crops need, a potential crop could use less water in the very beginning, it needs more in the middle when it's growing a lot, putting a lot of energy into its seeds or fruit or whatever, and then slightly less at the end, particularly for a lot of these starchy staple crops that we're examining, like maize, which you can allow to dry out, or even want to dry out a little bit close to harvest. Next slide. All right, and then I'll also briefly cover refrigeration, milk refrigeration as well. We are also in the process of perhaps making some final adjustments to this. Currently, we have data on estimates of the amount of cattle in any given location, again, from a global data set. the current methodology assumes that a flat amount of cattle in any area are milk producing cattle versus meat producing cattle, and it is a currently 34%, which was based off of a nationwide total of agricultural census data that we got from stakeholders Zambia, which was useful, but it's definitely the case that some areas produce cattle almost entirely for meat production, and some areas have much more cattle for dairy production. So this is something we'll be working on, probably tweaking a little bit, but for now, we're simply basing the amount of milk production based off of the amount of cattle in an area and assuming some percentage of them, about a third, are milk cattle. And then we just have some assumptions here about how much milk milk producing cow gives in a day, how many dairy cows are currently producing milk, how much milk goes to feeding calves when they are there. And basically at the end, that just gives us an assumed amount of milk per cow per day. And we can apply that to the amount of cattle that we have estimated for any given location to understand the amount of milk that we have to refrigerate. Next slide. And then finally, we use some assumptions about the sort of solar chillers that we might use for the mini grids that we're examining, and we can translate that amount of milk that needs to be cooled into energy uses using some translation constants here.
Great, thanks, Evan. Now to briefly describe how we come up with load estimates for poultry egg incubation. So again, we're combining geospatial data and estimates of the electricity demand for the various machines that might be used for the productive use. So in this case, we're looking at, we're using geospatial data to obtain the number of chickens in a given area. We then estimate how many of those chickens are layers. We then make an estimate of how many might be actively laying at any given time and how many eggs per day a layer typically produces. And then we looked at different small to medium scale egg incubation machines to get an estimate of the average power needed per egg per day. So from that, we can end up with an estimate of the total kilowatt hours per year needed for poultry egg incubation for, again, these kind of small to medium scale poultry egg incubation operations. Then the process is quite similar for milling, shelling, hulling, and oil pressing. So we just have kind of the general process summarized here. But to estimate the annual load for each of these productive uses, we look at crop data. So we have yield data for each of the crops that is relevant for each of these processes. So we have tons per year of yield of each crop. Then we estimate the percent of that crop that is processed. And again, then we looked at existing machines on the market to estimate the processing capacity, so the kilowatt hours needed to process 1 ton of each crop. And with these three components, then we can again arrive at an annual load calculation for milling, shelling, hulling, and oil pressing. So with the annual load estimates, we then need to translate that to when throughout the year is that load being used. Because again, the reopt optimization needs at least hourly load estimates in order to determine how to match generation and demand. We then need to, again, make estimates of when that load is being used. So here we're showing the load profile shapes for each of the productive uses over a 24-hour period. So we essentially we estimate over a given day, if we know the total amount of energy that's used in that day, when will the energy be used. And you can see for things like milling, oil pressing, rice hulling, maize shelling, that would be kind of following a typical business day of rising in the morning and having the peak around midday and falling as the workday ends. Before passing it back to Evan, I just wanted to address the one question in the Q&A box. So the question is, how is the average size in hectare or square kilometer of a mini grid defined? This is a great question. So we do not explicitly define an average size of a mini grid. Again, we're looking at a 10 square kilometer area, and we do not have information about where exactly the loads might be within that 10 square kilometer area. So for the mini grid modeling, we're assuming that the mini grid could serve the loads across that grid cell. And we allow the model to optimize the sizing of the systems in order to meet the estimated load. And so we do not apply land constraints on the solar PV sizing estimate, but we can then look at what would be the land required to host these solar panels, because we're looking at solar, battery storage, and diesel microgrid mini grids, and so the solar panels are really the ones that would require land. Does that answer the question? If not, I can certainly try to elaborate. Feel free to share. Okay, yep, great, thanks, Emmanuel. Wonderful. Well, with that, I will now pass it over to Evan to show kind of what the outcome is of all of these different estimates that we have been walking through. And I will stop sharing because I think Evan's going to do a live walkthrough.
All right, thanks. Let's hope this works. Okay, well, let's see here. Oh dear, it is. Not letting me do it at the moment. Let's just apologize for that. 1 second, let me see if I can debug this.
Let us know if there's anything we can do from our side, Evan.
I will, thanks.
And if anyone has any other questions at this time about what we just walked through, this would be a great time to address some of those, I think. So feel free, I think, to type them in the Q&A or the chat box, or if you're able to unmute, that works as well.
I will briefly highlight one of the reasons we've been doing these sorts of regional webinars is we hope to have some small support available for adapting some of these approaches in other partner countries of the AfLP. course, we're starting with deep work with Zambia and Kenya and soon to be Mozambique. But if there are others who are interested in this, we'd love to explore kind of how we can take some of this and tailor it to your local national contexts as well. So just keep that in mind. And apologies for the technical difficulties here.
So Emmanuel had another question, which is why was the reason, why do we use 10 square kilometers as the unit of analysis for this effort? And that is because that's the highest resolution at which we could get good geospatial data across Sub-Saharan Africa. And so that was basically the limiting factor for these load estimates, is we needed a lot of different data sets, and we needed the coverage to be universal for that area. And so 10 square kilometers was as good as we could get for the data we needed.
Yeah, just to note for everybody that while we are sorting out the technical issues, we have allowed all of the participants to unmute and speak. So if you have a question that you did want to ask live, please just raise your hand and we can get to it while we're waiting.
I also know we have some of our colleagues from both the Zambia team. I see Francis and Nancy on, and some colleagues from the Kenya team as well. So if there's anything you think we're missing or anything you'd like to add about the process or what we've been doing together, please feel free to chime in and share some of your experience with this as well.
Great, thanks. Emmanuel, I see your hand is up. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, Josh, thank you very much. My name is Emmanuel Chubisakunda from Plant a Million, and we transform African lives with tree coins. My question is, since I'm from Zambia, is there any opportunity in the model to insert Sentinel or higher resolution pictures? I understand the need for data on across Africa, but in the case of Zambia, any chance to tweak the model and insert higher resolution satellite images other than the 10 square kilometers? Thank you.
Maybe I can jump on that. I know Evan signed off and on, and he's our geospatial expert. He's trying to log in and out to get the screen sharing and whatnot working again. But I think the short answer is yes. So we're working right now together with our Zambia team. Again, we've got some of the members of the working group online here today. We're starting at this 10-kilometer resolution primarily as a way to help screen where we should be looking for more promising sites. The hope is that once we've identified maybe a handful of areas or a handful of regions, we can zoom in a little bit more and identify where within these areas are there communities, what is the distribution of residential loads, community loads and so forth. And I think an interesting piece of that, once we get to that, once we get to that level, would be looking at satellite imagery, specifically trying to identify kind of the relationship of individual communities to where crops are being grown, drawing out distribution network lines for mini-grids based on where we see different buildings and different crop clusters and whatnot. So great suggestion. And I'm keen to hear also from our Zambia colleagues, and I think absolutely that would be something we would be interested in possibly bringing in for a phase 2 once we kind of get to designing individual pilot sites based on kind of this initial screening.
Great, thanks, Tim. I see, Evan, you've been able to rejoin. Hopefully you should be able to, we've made you a co-host, so you should be able to share. Emmanuel, is that a new hand or an old hand? Ah, okay, good, it was an old hand. Yeah, so Evan, the floor is yours if you're able to share now.
I am still not seeing the share icon pop up.
Okay, let's just see if we can do that. It should be at the bottom of your screen now. We've made you a co-host.
I'm seeing Q&A, polls, chat, record, raise hand.
Okay, then let me just see. Okay, maybe. No, you should definitely be able to share it now. Roy, maybe just unclick co-host and click again. Okay, you should be able to now. Any luck?
No, I am not seeing it. All right. Well, I apologize for the
Evan,
inconvenience here.
Did you join this through the same link? I wonder if you accidentally joined as a participant instead of a panelist the second time.
I did join through the same link. Let me.
You're
definitely
definitely a panelist and co-host, so you should be able to.
All right, I am going to. I was joining through the browser, and Firefox did not want me to share my screen for permissions, so I'm going to install the full app here in Rejoin one more time. Again,
yeah,
apologies here.
No problem. Sometimes the browsers do not allow certain permissions.
All right.
Great. Well, while we wait, I invite any others to offer any questions, comments, suggestions. I also know we have some of our colleagues from USDA on the line who joined us today. Apologies for the technical difficulties here. But was curious if there are any initial thoughts or reactions from them. We've been really fortunate to partner with them and using some of the data that they help put together through various platforms as part of this. So wanted to give the floor, perhaps they'd like to offer any any thoughts as well, though certainly don't want to put anybody on the spot.
Looks like we have Evan back. Evan, are you back now?
I am, and I think hopefully this will work now.
Okay,
One
great.
second. All right, I think almost there.
Well, maybe I'll pose a question to the group while we wait. Is there anybody on the line who's also looking at agricultural productive uses, specifically irrigation and crop milling and refrigeration for various products? Anybody else who's looking at that from sort of an analytical perspective in their countries? Care to share some of their experiences? Looks like maybe Emmanuel has a hand up. I don't know if that's an old hand or a new hand.
No, thanks again. It's a new hand. I had actually, before I answer your question, I raised my hand because I was looking at the irrigation, page 10, which is crucial in the place like Zambia, where small-scale farmers mainly grow the crops rain-fed. So I'm trying to understand in that chart on the typical crop coefficiency curve, is the time of the season, is that the rainy season? Is it the full year? Because obviously, you can have added irrigation during the rainy season as well. And secondly, also then have full irrigation in the dry season. So I'm trying to understand for typical stable crops, maize and the likes, what's the assumption behind the curves? Is it full year or just the rainy season? And then after that, I can definitely share why and how are we looking into productive use of energy in some of the rural entrepreneurship hubs which have been set up. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I can take a stab at that. Well,
I could take a stab as well. Actually, can you not see my screen?
We can see your screen. All we see is your Google page right now.
Oh, great. Okay. No, well, that's perfect because that's where I am. So.
Oh, excellent. Well, then Evan, over to you to respond and take us through the demo.
My goodness, nothing is ever as easy as it should be. Thanks for bearing with us here. And apologies again. So, yeah. So to answer that, that question, we have to strike a balance with what we are uploading to the tool here in terms of what we can accomplish on a continental scale. So we have over 2 million study areas that we have data for. That's sort of what that 10 by 10 kilometer grid cell resolution works out at for all of sub-Saharan Africa. So we, in any particular location, we have granular enough data to model. We have the evapotranspiration data for every month. We have the precipitation data for every month. We could model basically any crop planted at any time, what the irrigation required for that crop planted at that time would be. For trying to understand where the best potential locations for productive uses would be, we took the assumption that at this level, where we're essentially using this as a screening tool, an idea of help us understand which areas we might want to be looking at more closely, we decided it was important sort of to understand what are the most important potential productive uses as they exist currently, and then perhaps for some of the more country-specific work or future work, we can look a little bit more at potential future uses, but we wanted to model essentially how crops are being grown currently. So what we do for the staple crops that we modeled irrigation for is to model supplemental irrigation during the main growing season, which for basically almost the entire continent means the rainiest season. And so we identify the wettest part of the year, and then we model the staple crops as being grown during that wettest part of the year. And then so in a lot of places, depending on the crop and depending on the climate, there's enough precipitation during the wet season to not really require supplemental irrigation at all, or if it is, it's very infrequent and not enough to be a major driver of productive energy use. What we generally see, at least in the places that we studied more in depth, like Kenya and Zambia, which do have very strong seasonal patterns with wet seasons and dry seasons, is that a lot of the irrigation energy use for those staple crops happens sort of at the beginning or the end of the wet season, when the rains are either just getting started or things are starting to dry up. And so that's what we tend to model as the supplemental irrigation for the staple crops. And then additionally, we do model more constant irrigation throughout the growing season in some of the drier, more marginal areas as well. The one crop that we didn't model during the wet season was vegetables, because we understand from discussions with stakeholders that it's very common for farmers to grow vegetables on their farms in the off season from their main staple crops, and that's a good way for them to make money and provide fresh vegetables at a time when not as much crops are available. So we did model the vegetables as being grown in the dry season, and then everything else is modeled in the wet season. Does that answer your question?
Yes, Evan, thank you very much. 100%.
Okay. So there was one other hand being raised there.
Yes, we had Abdul's hand is up. I don't know if you want to take that question now, Evan. If so,
if it's a relevant question, what I was just talking about, I can go ahead and try to answer it.
Over to you, Abdul. Do you want to ask your question if it's relevant to this?
Yeah, thank you, Josh. Yeah, this is a very productive engagement. My question would be generally to the team from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And my area is because it is a very, very important topic in agriculture in Africa. The transition studies have shown how important its energy efficiency could be when properly applied in the agricultural sector. So I want to see what the National Renewable Energy Laboratory is doing regarding storage, because studies have also shown that storage in agriculture sector is always a big challenge, especially in those regions in Africa where the erratic supply is very limited. And how do these agriculturalists be able to have an adequate storage? Because the presentation was very, very fantastic, looking at how to conserve it, but in a situation where you have a limitation in terms of availability. So how do we have an adequate storage facility by this sector?
Thanks for the question, and you are definitely correct. Storage is very important. I think there's probably there's sort of a narrow answer to your question that's directly relevant to our work that we're doing, and there's probably a broader answer to the question of sort of what work NREL is doing more broadly to help further energy storage in Africa. I might let Tim talk about that at the end here if he knows anything. The more narrow answer to your question is that when we model mini grids using REOPS, and Amanda, correct me if I'm wrong here, jump in with any additional information. What REOPS tries to do is to figure out the most cost-effective combination of solar panels, diesel generators, and batteries to be the most cost-effective way to get the energy demands of the mini grid met. So we definitely are considering batteries as a form of energy storage as one of the primary ways to build these mini grids. And correct me if I'm wrong, Amanda, but I believe most of Africa has very good solar resource and tends to produce a lot of solar energy production during the day. And so the way our mini grid modeling is going is it tends to choose to produce a lot of batteries over diesel generators in most locations, as it finds that ultimately to be cheaper. So yeah, we definitely are considering energy storage as one of the primary components of of these mini grids that are being built. Does that did I get everything right there, Amanda?
Yeah, that's okay. Yes, battery efficiency. So distributed generation of battery is a very new technologies that mostly consider, especially in that region of Africa. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, at the lab we do study other forms of energy storage broadly, but we aren't considering them in this model. Most other forms of energy storage, if not all, are much more expensive to build, and are generally sort of we think of as more of utility scale energy storage that isn't as appropriate to mini grids, where you can very easily size battery storage to exactly meet the needs of the grid. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Evan.
All right. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and well, I'll jump into the interactive map tool for in just a minute here. I did want to also just tag on to one thing that the one of the previous questions that Amanda answered a little bit about why the grid cells are 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers. And I think that's relevant to get into a little bit, just because this this data set that we're using as an input for the model is a pretty, I think, sophisticated data set. It produces estimates for total area harvested, which is important for irrigation, as well as total production of crops, which is important for things such as hammer milling, those other productive uses. And I do want to stress that this data didn't come out of nowhere. The core of the data actually is data from every constituent country, their own agricultural census production estimates. So the model is using data from the governments and local stakeholders in Africa, which we believe is important. But the problem with the data as it's reported, tends to be reported in those agricultural censuses, is that it's only at the sort of provincial level, or region or state, whatever they happen to be called in your country. But that's a much larger unit of analysis than we would typically be think of building mini grids at. And so it doesn't do us a lot of good to understand the crop patterns at this level. What this model does is combine those crop estimates from census of agricultural production estimates with other data sets such as land cover, satellite data, to try to apportion the amount of crops grown in each province to 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer grid cells. So that unit of analysis happens to be a pretty good unit of analysis to think about mini grids for. If there is a town or something in the middle of that grid cell that you can build some of these productive uses for, such as a hammer mill for maize. Basically, the vast majority of that grid cell is only about 5 kilometers away from the center of the grid cell. So it's possible to build productive uses here, or alternatively build transmission out to where productive uses need to be used in the field within a mini grid concept. Basically, the entire grid scale is at a distance where somebody can load up crops on a motorbike, or using draft animals, oxen or mules, or what have you, and take it to the productive use. So this data that we got from this data set happens to be a pretty good unit of analysis, we think, for thinking about mini grids. And so that's sort of where that came from. It may not be the most ideal. Maybe it would be better to think about 8 kilometer by 8 kilometer grid cells, but this is the highest resolution that we can get the data at. And so we combined all the other information that's available to the scale that this data is at. And just to scroll down here, just to show the number of organizations that are behind this model. It's funded by quite a bit of UN and World Bank sort of organizations. So we think this is probably the best data set out there to show this sort of information possible. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's talk about our geospatial data tool. So it's pretty exciting. We just recently got up our first iteration of these data sets onto our data platform. We will probably be tweaking a few things, maybe adding a few layers in the future, including at least one layer that one way or another helps translate our maybe more concretely helps us identify areas that we think are good for productive uses. But we do currently have data for predicted energy use up there, and I think that's a pretty exciting development. So this is online. It's publicly available, so you can go to a web app, follow along, or just sort of after this meeting or whatever you want. So the name of our platform that we have the geospatial platform on as part of is called the Reexplorer, or the Renewable Energy Explorer. So if you just Google Reexplorer, it'll take you there. It's also, we have a pretty simple URL as well. It's just reexplorer.org. So that works out. That's pretty easy to remember, but one way or the other, we can also send this out in email. But if you just Google Reexplorer, that should come up. So I just want to briefly note that there is quite a bit of information on the site. We have a lot of documentation on here, some recent papers and research that have been related to the tool, ways to contact people on the team to ask questions. So we're gonna sort of go straight to the geospatial platform, but I do want to just note that this site is not just the geospatial platform. There is a lot of good information on this site. If you're looking for some resources or just trying to better understand everything that's on here, then just this home site Reexplorer might be a good place to check. But to get to the actual geospatial platform, we're going to click on the Access Data Explorer tab here, and that will take us to the geospatial platform. So this will pop up with a form that will ask you some information about who you are and why you're interested in using this. I've already filled this out many times, but we do really appreciate if you fill out this form the first time you come here and are trying to just check out the data or use it for anything. Having some data on who's using our platform and for what reasons really help us make the platform better and tailor it to the correct people, and help us justify doing the work that we do. So yeah, if you do follow along or check this site out later, we do appreciate filling out that form. I'll close that for now, as I've already filled that out. And then there are several things you can do with this tool that is not sort of in the scope of what we're talking about. Everything that we'll be talking about today is basically within this data library tab, which just allows us to bring up data layers. So if we click on the data library, if you start typing, you'll see that there is a list of countries and regions come up. So if we just chose like one random country, we'll see that some countries that we've worked with specifically and worked with stakeholders locally before have more specific information, more data layers on there than not. some countries where we haven't done that sort of specific work just have some basic wind and solar resource data, for example. So that's generally how this works. Just search for a country or region and turn on some data layers. If we go back to this countries tab, the category that these layers are currently under is global. That might be a little bit confusing since it is just Africa, but we use this category for basically a catch-all for some data layers that aren't limited to a specific country, and this is continental. We might also break this up in the future so that there are country-by-country data sets as well. That might be helpful, but for right now, if you're looking for these data sets, it's just going to be part of this global region. And then go to data layers, and we'll see a bunch of layers come up. Some of these global layers are just, for instance, solar resource, but all of our productive use layers are part of the agricultural category. So one thing you can do to see them easily is to click on this category, and that will sort them by the category. Also, you can filter by the category. So now that I've put agricultural up here in this filter bar, only these layers are showing up. So there's a couple different ways to bring these up. So here we have layers of estimated productive uses for the productive uses that we've examined so far. So what we've seen, particularly in our stakeholder countries, but also pretty broadly across the continent, is that maize irrigation tends to be in most places one of the most dominant energy uses. So to see what that looks like, we can click on this checkbox, and that brings up this layer. The maize irrigation is a very important staple crop across the continent, not just in any one particular area. There's a lot of it produced across the continent, and also it tends to have a longer growing season, and is grown in places that it might need some supplemental irrigation at the beginning or end of a season, or in some areas that are just pretty dry and generally need some supplemental irrigation even if they aren't producing a ton. So something to note here is that you might be looking at your country and say, well, wait a second, we produce a lot of corn or maize. Why is there not estimated irrigation, maize irrigation? And there can be several reasons for that. Remember, this data uses data on evapotranspiration and precipitation and the predicted growing season for crops to try to understand the supplemental irrigation required over rainfall. So you notice that in sort of the center of the continent here, the wettest areas, there's not a lot of irrigation needs growing up, and that's going to be true for every crop basically, because much of this area is wet enough that there just doesn't, our methodology doesn't predict they're needing a bunch of supplemental irrigation. So that's might be what's happening. Or alternatively, certain areas might grow a lot of corn, and might not be as wet as the equatorial regions of the continent. But if they have a long enough and wet enough growing season, then even if the dry season is dry, then there might not need to be a lot of supplemental irrigation in the growing season. So another couple important things to note about the layer that comes up. Very important to look at the legends. The legend is similar, for instance, for all irrigation, but the level of energy for each different productive uses are too different all to display on the same scale. So it's important to keep the scale in mind when we're looking at any given place. And what this number essentially shows us is that this is the total annual kilowatt hours required that we're predicting for maize irrigation within that entire 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer grid cell. So this can seem in a lot of cases like quite a lot of energy, and it can be in certain places. However, 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer grid cell, that's 100 square kilometers. In certain areas where there's a lot of maize being grown, that can be a lot of ground to cover for irrigation. So in places where we're seeing a lot of irrigation being predicted for maize, that's usually the case. It's just that they grow quite a bit of maize. And so that's something to keep in mind. Another aspect we have here is that you can click this drop down and get a little more information about what the layer is. For instance, for these irrigation layers, we have some links to some of the sources that we use. For instance, this is a link to our potential evapotranspiration data set that we used. Let's just open that in a new tab, bring these layers up again. Okay, one other sort of nice aspect that you can use here is if you are zooming into any particular area for whatever reason, you know you have interest in a town because you live there, you know that there's interest in a project up there, something like that. It can be these ranges are so wide, it can be a little bit hard to understand what exactly this number is just by looking at it. So we do have a point query tool. So you can click on that point query tool, click on a specific area, choose the layer that you're querying, and all the layers that are visible on the map are going to be up at top. So there's only one visible right now, so that's going to be easy to choose. And then you can request query data. Okay, and so we could see that around this specific town, we are estimating just under 200,000 kilowatt hours for supplemental maize irrigation across the year. And then one other, I guess I should point out, not just the point query, if you were interested in understanding across like a broader region, you know, so within a few dozen kilometers within a certain town, you can also drag a box using this rectangular box tool, and then you can find data on the coordinates for each one of these locations and the predicted annual energy use for each one. So a couple different ways to query data there. So just step through what some of these other layers look like. So like I said, maize tends to be one of the dominant productive uses that we're seeing. For instance, if we look at groundnut irrigation, we certainly see some similar patterns. Most of the areas that have some irrigation are similar, but the patterns are a little bit different, and this just has to do with how much is grown in different areas and the different climates and sort of the different crop requirements necessary. So we see that groundnuts can also be a potential source, large source of irrigation in some areas, even if it's not quite as broadly needed as maize. And then, for instance, millet is there's quite a bit of millet grown across the continent as well, but it's a little more drought resistant. It requires less water than maize. So the places that require high amounts of millet irrigation are much smaller. A lot of places, for instance, in the countries we've been looking at, grow quite a bit of millet, but don't require a ton of supplemental irrigation just because the crop requires less water than maize. So these are examples of the sorts of explorations you can just start doing when you pull up these layers, just examining sort of the relative spatial patterns and size magnitudes of the irrigation that we're estimating for these different crops. There's sorghum, There's cowpeas. Again, cowpea is another quite drought hardy crop, requires less irrigation than maize. Okay, so that's a good idea of sort of some of the patterns that we're seeing with irrigation. Now let's look at maize milling. So this is an estimate on the amount of maize energy required for milling maize to turn it into meal or flour. So something very important to note here, now that we're not looking at irrigation anymore, the legend has changed and the scale is quite a bit lower. So we were looking at several hundred kilowatt hours in many places with irrigation totals, and these are almost all below 100,000 kilowatt hours. Something you can note here is that, for instance, we're starting to see more data pop up in these equatorial regions that are wet. They get enough precipitation that they don't have a ton of irrigation needs, but they still need to have energy to mill the maize after it's produced, for example. So that's one sort of interesting difference in the patterns between the milling and the irrigation that you can see. And again, there's just so much maize produced. This tends to be pretty high energy uses compared to some of the other ones. So for instance, sorghum milling, more broad-based than the sorghum irrigation, but just not, even at this reduced, smaller sort of scale, just not a ton of energy required in most places compared to irrigation. And just to give you know, an example of a couple other of the uses that we looked at, here's an example of what we think energy used for pressing oil out of groundnuts looks like. Again, the scales change, so this is even lower. So there's some energy use pretty broadly across the continent, but again, with this lower scale, it's pretty small compared to some of the other productive uses we looked at. And then here's egg incubation. As you can see, different patterns here make sense. It's sort of a different, completely different data set than crops as it's livestock. And again, this is at a much smaller scale than irrigation. So we do tend to see that irrigation, particularly maize irrigation, but other types of irrigation do tend to drive the vast majority of the total productive uses. So what we can turn on here is one layer here that shows all the productive uses combined. This is at a higher scale, so this goes all the way up to 1 million, with some places going well above 1 million. So that's why it might look, you might expect the sum total to look darker than the other ones, but that's mostly just a scaling issue. This is showing quite a few areas where we're predicting quite a bit of total productive uses. And just, I think, almost done here, just want to show a couple more examples of how we might be able to start using this in the future to start identify areas, and how we can combine this when we have more specific data from specific stakeholder countries. So for example, we can go back here and search for Kenya. We have some more data up here on Kenya because we've been working with them. And so something we can look at is where are transmission lines within Kenya. So this layer shows at least a general sort of schematic view of where transmission tends to be in Kenya. And as we can see, a lot of the prime agricultural land in Kenya tends to be close to larger population centers where there's a lot of transmission. So it's possible that a lot of these areas that have high agricultural productive use close to transmission lines, it might be easier to connect them to the existing grid, the utility scale grid, if they're not connected already, than to build a mini grid. But to the extent that this transmission data is accurate, we can also see some pockets in here in the main agricultural belt that aren't particularly close to transmission. And in some of these places, it might be easier to build mini grids than to build big, long transmission spur lines out to connect to the grid. Or sort of another example is we see certain areas where there might be small localized amounts of productive use that are sort of far away from the main grid. And these areas can be very remote, probably very far from transmission. These more remote areas with some higher productive uses might be good candidates for mini grids as opposed to connecting to the main grid. And then one last thing we can sort of add here is just a yeah, let's add this, a layer for solar radiation. So this then lets us get some idea of once we've identified potential areas where there might be mini grids might be appropriate, we can turn on the irradiance and we could see, oh, well, great, this particular location actually has very, very high solar irradiance. So not only is a good potential area for a mini grid, but it also is likely going to have a relatively low LCOE for solar panels, and it's going to produce a lot of energy from LCOE. Down here in this pocket that we are looking at earlier, we can then turn on the irradiance layer again and see that it's still pretty high up on the legend, but it's not quite as high. So so might be a little bit different LCOE as that area in the northern part of the country that we're looking at, but nonetheless, we still see an opportunity here, area with a lot of productive uses, not necessarily super close to transmission, and that still has pretty good global solar radiation. So it does seem, we could start combining these layers and tools that we have up here to start thinking about things like that. Like this potentially seems like a good confluence of factors where mini grids supporting these productive uses might be really efficient. All right, I think that's basically what we have to show you. So I'm sure we have
Evan, while you were still on the data set, there was a question from Emmanuel who was asking where one would be able to see the year of the data set. If he was looking at, for example, wind in Zambia, are you able to select the particular year of the data set?
Yeah, that's a great question. So unfortunately for wind specifically, we at NREL have not specifically modeled wind models over Africa, which means that the wind that you see, the wind layers that you see, we're just hosting data from the Global Wind Atlas, which is a really nice data source. But that is just a long-term predicted average. So there's no particular year associated with it. What they use, I think, is a 20-year, they did a 20 or 30-year study of wind speeds from something like 1988 to 2018 or something like that to sort of predict what the long-term average wind speeds are. But unfortunately, we don't have years for that. For the for solar data, we have modeled 3 years of solar data for Africa at NREL using our modeling capabilities and using the Himawari satellite. So here you can see, if you just search for GHI global horizontal radiation, we have it's actually 4 years. We have a long-term mean, and then we have 4 years available. So if you're interested in at the different values, looks like these are not popping up right now. Sometimes they just, if they haven't been hit in a while, sometimes they can take a while to pop up. But I'll definitely take a look into that. But you should be able to choose different layers here of different layers of different years of for the solar data sets in particular. But yeah, that is not possible for wind at the moment. We just have the long-term mean for wind. But it should be if there are years, then it should be noted in the title. And basically our agricultural productive uses also are based off of long-term mean data. So there's not really that's just our best guess at the annual average. There's no real year associated with any of the productive use data. Anything else?
No, I think I don't see any more questions so far. Thank you. Great. So thank you very much for that, Evan. Just looking at the time, we are almost at the top of the top of the hour in terms of the duration for this webinar. And thank you so much to everybody for your patience and for sticking with us through to the end. Tim, can I hand over to you for maybe a few final words before we close out?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Josh, and thanks Evan and Amanda, and thanks everyone for joining. Again, apologies for the technical issues there. Thanks for sticking with us. I believe we will have a recording of today's session available, posted. Josh and the AfLP team will send a follow-up email with a link to that once it's up and available. So I just wanted to wrap up and kind of reiterate what I had mentioned earlier. We do through the CTSL program and through emerging work coming down the line with the Africa-led partnership. Really interested to hear from all of you about interest in taking this tool and using it, maybe developing applications in your own countries. Evan walked through and showed kind of how this can be used and combined with, for example, transmission infrastructure information for Kenya to start identifying where do the mini grids kind of grounded in agricultural productive uses possibly make sense. So really keen to hear from all of you how we can take this and apply it in other countries in your context. We'll be following up with those of you who attended today shortly after the session. I'm trying to set up consultations with those who are interested in maybe learning more about the tool. And of course, please feel free to reach out with us at any time if there's questions. It is now a public tool. You can go to the Reexplorer website there that I dropped the link into the chat here. You can go there, start playing around with it, see what's available for your country, for elsewhere, and go in. So I really encourage everyone to explore the tool. Maybe once you've had a chance to check it out, let us know if you have questions, suggestions. We want to make sure that this tool is really useful to those of you, to all the practitioners on the ground actually doing this work. So very much open to suggestions and feedback on how we can improve it and make the most value out of it. So I think I'll stop there. But yeah, big thanks again, everybody, for joining. And please don't hesitate to reach out anytime. Thanks all. Enjoy the rest of your day.
And thank you so much to you, Tim, Amanda, and to Evan and the team at NREL for this. As Tim mentioned, we will, in our post-coms, we will be emailing everybody, all of the attendees, in addition to posting the recording and all of the details onto the website, as well as any necessary links and email addresses, and hopefully we can have some further engagement. And obviously, if you need anything, then you can also email us at the Secretariat. But on behalf of the Africa-led Partnership Secretariat, thank you all for attending and hope you have a wonderful day.